It was 1987. I'd spent the summer in Indiana helping my grandparents out at their house. I was only young at the time, and I'd just broken up with my abusive boyfriend. I knew that he was dangerous and had been stalking me at the time, so I decided to leave town and start a new life elsewhere. I remember on one particular day, I was walking down a dusty road, and all of a sudden my heart started to race with fear. I saw a red car approaching me from behind. It was a beat-up old station wagon, driven by a woman who looked to be in her 50s. I hesitated for a moment, but then when I saw she was a woman, I was unsure if I could trust her, but I knew that I couldn't keep running forever. She pulled over and asked me if I needed a ride. Again I hesitated, but when I looked back and saw my ex-boyfriend's car in the distance, I knew that I had no choice but to get in. The woman introduced herself as Anne and seemed friendly enough. We chatted as we drove along the country roads, and I started to feel more at ease as time went by. But then, as we turned onto a quiet dirt road, I noticed that Anne had a strange look in her eyes. Why had she turned into this road? It certainly wasn't in the right direction. She started to ask me personal questions about my life, and I could feel my heart, once again, racing with fear. I tried to keep a straight face and stay calm, and just make light small talk with her, but I knew something was wrong. I humoured her for a few more minutes, but then I started to look for an escape route. The windows were rolled up tight, so that wasn't an option. If I was going to escape, I would need to open the door and run for my life. I sat for a while and realised that her eyes were always on me. If I attempted to escape, she would just chase me in the car and possibly run me over, which I didn't want to happen. But just when I thought that all hope was lost, I remembered something that my mother had taught me when I was younger. She had always told me that if I was ever in trouble, I should look for a way to disarm my attacker and use their own weapon against them. My mum was ex-police force, but she had to retire early due to an injury. So with this advice in mind, I waited until Anne was distracted, and then I lunged forward and grabbed the keys out of the ignition. I twisted them until the engine died, and then I used the opportunity to jump out of the car and start running as fast as I could. This way I knew she wouldn't be able to chase me in the car and would have to run on foot, and I hoped that I would be quicker. With pure adrenaline running through my body, I could hear Anne screaming behind me, but I didn't stop and I kept going until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police station and reported what happened, and they were able to track down Anne and arrest her for attempted kidnapping. She tried to deny it and just say we were friends, but they knew right away this was a 50-year-old woman and a young girl. There was something up. A few months later, she was sentenced to a few years in prison. I don't remember how long, but that was good enough for me. I knew that from that day I should be more careful when hitchhiking. I'm one of those people that never tends to give up, and I'm the same with hitchhiking. I mean, I love it. I love meeting new people, and I love the adventure. But I'm certainly a lot more careful when I do it. But the best part of that day is that it taught me that I have the strength and courage to fight back if I ever find myself in that kind of danger again. So I know next time, I'll be prepared. For as long as I can remember, I'd always dreamed of being a star in Hollywood. But foolishly, I thought the only important part was just to get there, and once I'd arrive, I'd figure everything out. So with no money, I decided to hitchhike across America from my hometown of New York City. I was naive, but I was determined to make my dream a reality, so there was nothing that was going to stop me. I set out early one morning with nothing but a backpack and a dream. To my luck, I managed to catch a quick ride with a friendly truck driver who promised to take me all the way to California. I didn't question his kindness, and I just got in enthusiastically. I was so excited that I didn't even notice that the minute I got into that car, the doors were locked. This was going to be a long and bumpy ride, I thought. As we drove across the country, the driver started to become more and more aggressive. As we drove across the country, we actually managed to have some fun. We would play those stupid car games, and he actually made me laugh a few times. But every now and again, he'd make an inappropriate comment, and I could tell he was trying to touch me. I just tried to ignore him and keep my head down, but it was getting harder and harder to do so. That dream was slowly fading, and the more I thought about escaping, the more the dream would escape me. So reluctantly, I remained in that car. But one night, the driver pulled into a rundown motel in the middle of nowhere. He said that we were going to stay there for the night, but I had a bad feeling about it. As soon as we got into the room, he locked the door and started to make advances towards me. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to fight him off, but he was much stronger than me. I realised that I needed to escape before it was too late, so I waited until he was asleep and then quietly snuck out of the room. I won't go into too much detail about what happened before that, for obvious reasons, but I'm sure you can use your imagination to fill in the blanks. I wandered around the motel parking lot, looking for anyone who could help me. That's when I saw a man cleaning the windows of a car. I ran up to him, tears streaming down my face, and I begged him to help me. At first the man was hesitant to get involved, but then he saw the fear in my eyes and knew that he couldn't just turn his back on me. He listened to my story and then came up with a plan to get me out of there. He knocked on my hotel door and he asked the truck driver that he needed to borrow the truck to run an errand, and strangely the driver agreed, for a fee of course. The man took me to the nearest police station and helped me file a report. I was safe, but I was still a long way from home. The kind man who saved me could see that I was in such a fragile state, and he actually offered to drive me to California himself. Based on my previous experience, I was hesitant to accept this offer. But after what he did for me, he seemed like a kind and trustworthy guy, so I said yes. As we drove towards California, this man told me stories about his own struggles and how he had overcome them. He actually gave me hope and helped me see that there was still a future for me, even if it wasn't the one that I had originally planned. He told me about all the failed Hollywood actors and how they would go there and end up miserable and alone. I was worried after our conversation that that would be me, but I was still excited to get started as soon as possible. We eventually arrived in Hollywood a few days later, and the man dropped me off at a hotel. He wished me luck and told me that he believed in me. I never saw that man again. In fact, I don't think I ever got his name. But I will always be grateful for his kindness and compassion. You know, I learned that day that not all strangers are dangerous, and there are good people out there who are willing to help. But saying that, I would never get into the car with a stranger again, no matter what. After a few years, my dreams of being a Hollywood star shattered, and I didn't make it anywhere. After a few failed acting performances and a few cancelled projects, I realised that the Hollywood life just wasn't for me. But although my dream had come crashing down, I still appreciated the entire experience because I'd gained something much more valuable than a dream. I now had a newfound appreciation for the kindness of strangers and the importance of human connection, as well as a real zest for life and appreciation just for being alive. I still remember the morning of the day I decided to leave Mexico for good. I woke up that morning so excited, looking forward to the future I had ahead of me. I was leaving for the United States, for a better life with more opportunity. Don't get me wrong, I was scared, as I was going alone, but I thought I had to leave. My family was struggling, and I wanted to help them out. So I decided to hitchhike with a few strangers, and eventually was able to get into an American man's truck. At first the driver seemed friendly, and even offered me some food, but as the hours passed, he began to become more aggressive and started to make unwanted advances. I knew I'd made a mistake by getting into his truck, but I really wanted to get into the United States and I was in no position to be turning down offers. I swallowed my pride and I remained in the truck, but things got worse when I realised that the seatbelt wasn't fastened properly. We were driving down a dark and deserted road and the driver was going way too fast. I was holding on to my chair as if I was on a roller coaster ride, when suddenly I heard a loud bang and the truck veered off the road. The driver got out to inspect the damage and realised that we had a flat tyre. I remember at the time it felt like God had tried to intervene and save my life. So as he was changing the tyre, I noticed a pipe in the back seat. The adrenaline suddenly struck me as I realised I had to use it for my defence. I watched out of the window as he finished changing the tyre, and then he slowly got back into the truck and started to drive. I knew I had to do something though. I wanted to escape, but I was too scared. As we continued to drive, I searched for anything that could help me escape. Finally I saw an abandoned petrol station in the distance. I checked the dashboard of the truck. I didn't know English very well, but I could see that the fuel tank was low. I knew the driver would have to stop eventually. So I said to him, "I need to use the bathroom." I saw the driver check his dashboard, and then he muttered something under his breath, followed by, Sure, fine, whatever. I could see the petrol station not far off in the distance, but then we hit a red light. Instinctively, I unbuckled my broken seatbelt and jumped out of the truck. I ran towards the petrol station, hoping to find help. It was the middle of the night, so there wasn't many people about, but there were lights on, and I felt like somehow this would be safe, at least more safe than being back in that truck. When I arrived, I saw two homeless men sleeping on the ground. I approached them and explained my situation. To my surprise, they were actually really kind, and they promised to protect me. But as we were talking, we heard the truck driver's voice approaching. One of the homeless men told me to hide while he talked to the driver. I watched in terror through the crack of a cupboard door as the driver walked into that petrol station and immediately started to search for me. The homeless men came to my aid, acting surprised, and were able to convince him that they hadn't seen me at all. After a few minutes of convincing, the driver eventually left, and I was so relieved. One of the homeless men actually offered to walk me to the nearest place with a telephone, and I agreed. Once we arrived, I called 911, and the police came to pick me up. They were able to arrest the driver, and I was finally safe. I remember thinking once I get to the United States, everything will be better, it will be safer, I will be happier. But the moment I entered those borders, my life turned upside down. I will never forget the kindness and bravery of those two homeless men. They risked their own safety to protect me, and I'm eternally grateful to them. It was through this experience that I realized that Mexico is actually a beautiful country, and I never should have left. I still remember the day like it was yesterday. I remember it was getting late, and I needed a ride to the next town over, where I had some important business to attend to. I'd crashed my car a few weeks back, so for me it was the bus or walking, and that was about it. After a few minutes of waiting for the bus, I realised that it was taking too long, and a car pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down his window and asked me where I was headed. I told him the name of the town, and he said he was heading that way too. I thought this was a crazy coincidence, so I immediately said, "Do you mind if you could give me a ride?" He smiled and said yes, so I got into the car. As we drove, I noticed that the driver kept looking at me strangely. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I felt. He asked me questions about my family and my plans for the future, and I tried to answer them politely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the way he was asking me. Almost like he was enjoying the words leaving my mouth just a little bit too much. We were driving down a dark, deserted road when suddenly the car started to slow down. The guy turned to me and said, "You know, I thought you were just a little girl at first, but now I look at you and I can see that you're a woman. A very beautiful woman." As soon as these words left his mouth, my heart started to race as he leaned over and tried to touch me. I pushed him away and attempted to open the door, but it was locked. I tried to unlock it, but the lock was broken and I was trapped. The driver just laughed and said, "Don't worry, honey, I won't hurt you. I just want to have some fun." He reached for me again, but this time I was ready. I was wearing a thick pair of heels at the time, so I kicked off one of my shoes and I grabbed it and hit him as hard as I could. He slumped over, unconscious. I quickly got out of the car and started running down the road. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from that man as possible. As I ran, I could hear the sound of the car engine revving up, and I knew he was conscious once more. I turned around and saw him driving after me, so I started to run faster, but it was no use as he was gaining on me. He was sticking his hand out of the window, almost as if he was trying to grab me while he drove by. But just as he was about to approach, a car appeared out of nowhere and crashed into his, sending it spinning out of control. The driver stumbled out of the car, dazed and confused. I looked at the person who had saved me and was shocked to see that it was a woman. She was about my age with a wild look in her eyes. She told me to get into her car and she drove me to the nearest police station. The whole time she kept muttering to herself and laughing hysterically. When we got to the police station, I told the officers what had happened. They arrested the man and took me home, and I never saw that woman again who saved me, but I will never forget her. She may have been crazy, but she was my saviour that night, almost as if she had anticipated that something bad was happening. From that day on, I never hitchhiked again. I learnt that sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry, and you should never trust a stranger on the road, no matter how strange a coincidence it is that they just happen to be going in the same direction as you are. Tommy was so excited to show his uncle his new baseball skills. He had been practicing for weeks and was finally ready to show off his moves. His uncle had promised to come to the game, but when Tommy's team eventually won, he couldn't find his uncle anywhere. Tommy searched the parking lot, but all he saw was a car that looked just like his uncle's, so he ran up to it, but as he opened the door, he realised it wasn't his uncle's car at all. A strange man climbed into the driver's seat and smiled at Tommy. "Hey there, little buddy. Need a ride?" Tommy didn't know what to do. The man seemed nice enough though, but something about him made Tommy's skin crawl. I don't know," Tommy said nervously. "I'm supposed to wait for my uncle." The man just laughed. "Well, maybe we can find him together. Get in." Tommy reluctantly climbed into the car, his heart pounding in his chest. For some reason he felt obliged to listen to what he said. He didn't know this man, and he didn't want to be alone with him. As they drove down the highway, Tommy tried to make small talk, but the man didn't seem interested in talking anymore. He just kept staring straight ahead. Eventually the man pulled off the road and parked the car in an abandoned gas station. "Okay kid, time to get out," the man said, turning to face Tommy. Tommy now realised he was in deep trouble. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. "Let me out!" Tommy screamed, pounding on the window. But the man just laughed. "Calm down, kid. I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to make a quick stop." Tommy didn't believe him. He knew that he had to get out of the car before something bad happened. But just then, a police car pulled into the gas station. The man panicked and ran away, leaving Tommy alone in the car. The police officers had received a tip that Tommy had been kidnapped. Just a moment before, Tommy was scared and alone, but now he was relieved to be safe. Tommy's parents were in one of the police cars, and they got out and ran towards him. As Tommy's parents hugged him tightly, they realised that they should never have let him go to that baseball game. From now on, they promised to always keep a closer eye on him. Tommy's uncle was devastated too. He didn't turn up because he was busy with work that day, but failed to let Tommy know. He never thought that he would get into somebody else's car. But from that experience, Tommy learned a valuable lesson. He knew that he should never get into a car with a stranger. A few years ago, I was on my way to a job interview in a nearby city, but the night before, my car had annoyingly broken down. I checked the buses and the trains, but there was nothing running that day, and I quickly realised I had run out of other options. I didn't want to miss my job interview and potentially lose out on my dream job, so I decided, reluctantly, to try and hitchhike. Now, I'd never done this before. It was something that I'd only read about or seen in movies. So believe me when I tell you, it was a last resort. But nonetheless, I left my house and I walked to a nearby bus shelter. I knew the buses weren't running, but I thought I'd try my luck anyway. After a few unsuccessful attempts, a car eventually pulled over and the driver actually offered me a ride. To my joy, the man looked harmless, and I didn't want to be late for my interview, so I immediately accepted. As we drove, I couldn't believe my luck. This was one of the nicest guys I'd ever met. We laughed, we joked, and eventually I started opening up to him. But once I mentioned how old I was, I noticed that the driver's behaviour began to change. He would give me these weird glances, and our conversations began to become disjointed and erratic. It was at this moment I wished that I hadn't accepted the ride, and I started to fear for my life. The driver looked me dead in the eye, and he told me a joke, but it wasn't very funny. I noticed that there was a crazed look in his eyes though, so I felt like I had to humour him, and I gave out a small chuckle. He responded, "Are you laughing at me?" Surprised, I turned back saying, "No, of course not." He looked down at his lap, and then he looked back at me. "You better not be laughing at me." I was so confused. This whole journey we'd been laughing together and making jokes, so why all of a sudden had he become so serious? I apologised one last time, and he just stopped looking at me and continued driving. Now I was really scared. I mean, what the hell was that, right? After a few more minutes of driving in silence, I started to peer out the window. I was watching people walk along the sidewalk, and it made me wish that I'd just done the same thing, although I would have been walking for hours. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I was alerted to a sharp feeling in the side of my back. I turned to see the man with a knife in his hand, and he demanded that I give him all of my money and my belongings. I was terrified and shocked, and I didn't know what to do. I knew this guy was weird, but I never thought he would have done that. I immediately handed over my wallet and phone, hoping that it would be enough to satisfy him, but it wasn't. He forced me out of the car and tied me up with a rope, leaving me on the side of the road. I was so confused and scared. I mean, why was he doing this to me? Was all of this just a plot to rob me? I struggled to break free and managed to loosen the rope, but my hands were still bound. As I tried to wriggle free, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. It was a group of men who had been hiking in the nearby woods. They untied me and called the police. The police quickly arrived and took my statement, and they searched for the driver, but he had disappeared without a trace. I never did make it to my job interview, and the experience left me shaken and traumatized. That was the first and last time I ever hitchhiked. I realized it wasn't worth the risk, and my safety was more important than getting to my destination quickly. I was a college student, studying abroad in the United States. I had always been fascinated with American culture and was eager to explore as much of the country as possible. I was born and raised in China, so it was a completely different kind of place. One weekend, I decided to hitchhike to a nearby city to visit a friend. A few weeks prior, she had moved over from China as well, and I really wanted to see her because I wanted to share our experiences. So on this day, I stood on the side of the road with my backpack, thumb extended, just as I'd seen in the movies. After a while, a car pulled over, and the driver, who was a middle-aged man, offered me a ride. I hesitated at first, but then I realised what other type of person would actually stop for a woman and help give her a lift. So I tried to look in his eyes and test whether or not he was a good person, and he seemed friendly enough, so I actually got into that car. Looking back now, I can't believe how stupid I was, but I was young and naive. As soon as we were on the road, I immediately realised that it was a mistake. The man was asking me personal questions, like where I was from and if I had a boyfriend. He kept making inappropriate comments and he kept touching my leg. I felt scared and trapped with no way out. He would do this thing where he would just stare at me, and if I didn't stare back, he wouldn't look where he was going, so I felt obliged to stare in his eyes. Each time I looked back at him, he just chuckled to himself, almost as if he was just playing games with me. After a while, we pulled off the highway into a more deserted area. The car started to slow down, and this is when I realised that he had turned off the engine and the car was bringing itself to a stop. He looked at me with a sinister expression and said, "You're mine now." I was terrified. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, so I fumbled with my seatbelt, but it just wouldn't release. The man reached over and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. I struggled and screamed, but it was no use. Just when I thought it was all over, I remembered something that my father had told me. He always said that in times of trouble, I should pray to Buddha for help. So with nothing left to lose, I closed my eyes and silently prayed for a way out. I could feel his hands all over me, and I just wanted to die right then and there. But all of a sudden, the car jolted and shook. The man looked alarmed and got out of the car to investigate. That's when I saw it. A rusty pipe lying on the ground next to the car. As the man went to investigate, I quickly kicked myself out of the car and onto the ground. The man was so focused on investigating that he didn't even realise that I'd left the car. I didn't look back, so I don't know how long it took him to notice that I'd left, but I'm sure he realised soon enough. I ran inside an old abandoned shed. There was nothing in there other than broken wood and bits of plastic. I hid in there for hours, hoping that he wouldn't find me, and to my luck, he never came by. To this day, I don't know if he even tried to look for me. Maybe he just cut his losses and left as soon as I'd run off. But I wasn't going to risk it. I hid in that shed for another few hours until I eventually realised I couldn't wait in there forever. I slowly creaked open the door, and I looked to see if there was anyone out there. All I could see was an empty road and desert in the distance. I realised I had no other choice than to start walking down the highway in the hopes that I could find some sense of civilization. After a few hours of walking, I eventually stumbled upon a small town. As I entered the town, I was hoping to find somebody I could talk to, somebody who could help me get home, because I had no idea where I was. To my dismay, nobody seemed to be out. The town was empty. It was like a ghost town. I found a shop that read pharmacy on its sign, so I tried to go inside to see if there was anybody working, but the door was locked. I started to hear a door banging and realised the wind was blowing hard. A storm was approaching, and I was all alone. I felt like I was at a loss, so I just sat down, cross-legged, and I started praying to Buddha once again. I mean, he saved me the last time, right? After a few minutes, I felt a distant rumble, and it caused me to instinctively open my eyes. I looked forward, and I saw the familiar lights of a police car approaching slowly. I immediately rose to my feet, and I sprinted towards the police car, waving my arms and screaming for their attention. A policeman climbed out of the car, looking nervous with his hand on his belt. At this point I realised he might be scared that I was in some way threatening him, so I lowered my hands and I went to the floor. I begged them to help me. The policeman could see the fear in my eyes, so he slowly approached me. And immediately they started to search the area to see if they could find the man's car. But unfortunately, he was nowhere to be found. At this point it had been hours since I left his car, and I'm sure he was in another state by now. I was left shaken, but grateful to be alive. The police took me to the station and I gave them a statement. They promised to do everything in their power to find the man who had tried to harm me. But I'm yet to hear back from them, so I'd imagine he's still out there, somewhere. I was a struggling actor in the 1960s, always on the lookout for any opportunity to make a name for myself. So when I heard about a potential gig in California, I jumped at the chance. The only problem was that I was broke and needed a ride. So that's when I made the terrible decision to hitchhike. Now, you need to know that in those days, this wasn't really that weird. Lots of people hitchhiked, and it was just sort of the way you got around. But looking back, I can see how dangerous it was, and as more stories crop up nowadays, I realised what a risk it really was. On this particular day, I stood on the side of the road hoping for a ride, and after a few hours, a car pulled over. I couldn't make out the driver's face, but I was just happy to have a ride, so I hopped in, and before I knew it, we were off. The driver would laugh at things that weren't funny, and he'd just stare at me with this creepy smile. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease just kept growing stronger with each passing mile. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of weird people in my life, but to be honest, this guy really took the cake. Almost out of nowhere, the car started to screech, and then it brought itself to a halt. The driver turned to me with a sinister look in his eye and told me he needed to make a stop. I looked out the window, and to my surprise, I didn't see anything. We were just in the middle of the road, nothing around. I was scared and didn't know what to do. The guy got out the car and he just walked to the side of the road, staring at the sky. I had absolutely no idea what he wanted, but I just sat there and waited. After around 5 minutes I realised that something was wrong. This guy wasn't just weird, he was crazy. I started to become really scared and I didn't know what to do, so I decided to just make a run for it while he was distracted by God knows what. Just as I tried to open the door, almost instinctively the driver turned around and he came back to the car. He opened the door and told me to get out, and at this point I knew I was in trouble. He forced me to walk with him through the woods, and I was terrified. My heart raced as I wondered what he was going to do to me. Suddenly he stopped and pointed to an old cabin. "This is where we're going," he said with a sinister grin. Inside the cabin I saw that there were chains hanging from the ceiling and a table filled with knives and other sharp objects. I was in a real-life horror movie. The driver laughed and told me that I was going to be the star of his latest film. He was a filmmaker and he'd been searching for the perfect victim to star in his snuff film. Well, I'd got my wish, right? I was going to be a star. I tried to run, but he caught me and tied me up with ropes. He turned on the camera and started filming. I screamed and begged for mercy, but he just laughed, bringing the camera closer to my face. Hours passed and I thought it was all over, but then there was a knock at the door. The driver paused the camera and went to answer it. I could hear muffled voices, and then I heard the sound of a struggle. It was the police. Apparently there was another victim that was at the cabin a few weeks back and he was able to escape, and it just so happened that the time that I was taken into that cabin, the police were doing their checks around the area. The driver was immediately arrested and I was freed, and from that day I've realised just how lucky I am to be alive. I never hitchhiked again, and I learnt my lesson and realised that sometimes the price of fame really is too high. It was the summer of 1975, and I was driving alone down a dusty, deserted road. I had just left a party and was feeling a bit buzzed, but confident in my driving skills. As I drove, I seemed to see a figure on the side of the road. It looked like a hitchhiker. He was a handsome man, with a big smile, and a laugh that seemed to echo through the empty road. He looked harmless enough, so I pulled over and offered him a ride. As soon as he got into the car, I could feel a sense of danger emanating from him, but there was something mesmerising about him as well. Something that made me unable to look away or even think about kicking him out of the car. As we drove along, he told me stories of his travels and adventures, but the more he spoke, the more uneasy I became. His stories started to sound more and more sinister, and I began to feel scared. Suddenly, he locked the doors from his side, and I realised with a sinking feeling that I was now in trouble. I tried to scream and cry for help, but he just laughed and told me to relax. I knew I had to do something, but I just couldn't think straight. That's when I saw the headlights of a car coming directly towards us. I pulled the car to the side of the road, and the hitchhiker got out and disappeared into the darkness. I was shaking with fear as the other car pulled up beside me. The driver, an older gentleman, asked if I was okay. I told him what had just happened, and he drove me to a nearby park bench where I could catch my breath and calm down. As I sat there, I realised how close I had come to a terrible fate. From that day on, I promised myself that I would never pick up a hitchhiker again. This is a story about my old friend Lena. She had a strange upbringing, and she'd always been a bit of an oddball. She loved to wear mismatched socks and collect vintage lunchboxes from the 70s. So when she decided to hitchhike across the country to visit her estranged father, me and my friends weren't surprised at all. She told me this story a few years later. At first she was too embarrassed, but I was so happy when she opened up, and now we always like to tell this story whenever we get together. On one particular day where she was planning to hitchhike, she stood on the side of the road with her thumb out. But on this day, she couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. Lena had never hitchhiked before. I mean, she didn't know what kind of people she might encounter. But that didn't stop her, and finally a beat-up old Volkswagen Beetle pulled over, and Lena hesitantly climbed in. I think the reason she got into that car was because the driver was a middle-aged woman with wild curly hair and a tie-dyed t-shirt. And maybe she just felt like she was the sort of person that she'd get on with. Nevertheless, when Lena got in the car, she was as polite as ever. "Thanks for stopping," she said, trying to sound confident. "No problem, man," the driver replied with a toothy grin. "Where you headed?" "I'm going to see my dad," Lena said, feeling a lump form in her throat. The driver nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, family can be tough sometimes, but you know what they say, no matter how crazy your family is, someone out there has it worse." Lena chuckled nervously. She was starting to feel a little bit better. Maybe this driver wasn't so bad after all. But as they drove deeper into the countryside, Lena couldn't shake that feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just because this was the first time she'd ever hitchhiked. But the driver kept muttering to herself and making strange hand gestures. Lena started to think that she was in the car with a crazy person, and maybe what the woman had said earlier was based on truth. With a moment's notice, Lena decided to make a run for it when the driver stopped at a gas station to fill up. But as she was fumbling with the door handle, the driver turned around and gave her a stern look. "What's the matter, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lena blushed with embarrassment. "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought, I didn't know if... I'm sorry." The driver just laughed. "Relax, sweetie. I may be a little weird, but I'm not evil." Lena decided to sit down, and as they drove on, the driver kept telling funny stories and singing along to old rock songs to help put Lena at ease. At this point, Lena started to feel like she was on a road trip with her wacky aunt, instead of in the car with a possibly dangerous stranger. But finally, they arrived at Lena's estranged father's house. She was nervous, but the driver squeezed her hand and gave her an encouraging smile. "Remember, no matter what happens, you're not alone," she said. Lena nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude all of a sudden. But as she left the car, she headed for the door and rang the bell. But once the door opened, Lena's father was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she was face to face with a pair of police officers. It turned out that Lena's father had been arrested for embezzlement, and Lena was devastated. But she was also relieved that she hadn't been alone with them, and she turned to thank the driver, but she was already gone. As Lena walked away from the house, she felt a sense of peace. She knew that even though she was a bit of an oddball, she had people in her life who cared about her, and she knew that no matter where the road took her, she could always find a way to make it fun. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video.